Grief Counselling is the fourth episode of the third season of The Office. This is directed by Roger Nygard, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. In general, really enjoyed it. Some funny moments, quite an unpredictable episode, but unfortunately, I did not care for Jim in this. And I hate to say that because Jim's one of my favourite characters, and up until this point, and there will obviously be spoilers not just for this episode, but previous episodes. When Jim transferred, I think from then they've done a reasonable attempt at bringing him into the show still and making his appearances relatively interesting. But in this one, tremendously boring. So I'll talk about Jim first in a moment, then I'll talk about the main narrative. The episode starts off with Michael doing his stare routine. A nice, fun, light-hearted way to kick things off. Jim's part of the story basically involves him, I guess, flirting with Karen, but at the same time, I feel like Jim is just a very nice, smooth individual anyway, and I feel like he would do this for anybody, but I'm still getting the vibe that he's interested in Karen, which I don't like. I want him to be with Pam. I'm not saying he's not allowed to be happy with anybody else, but that's not what I want. And he's trying to find these chips for Karen, and honestly, it was very boring. I didn't care at all. I also don't like Karen, so that kind of further makes me not want him to be with Karen, but I don't know what they're going to do with that. Either way, Jim in this, honestly not very interesting. There's a brief moment with Roy when he rescues Pam from a grief session, which I'll talk about in a moment, and he takes her to look at her car, and it was fine. It was okay. I didn't care for it, but it was fine. But just after they're talking, it cuts to Jim, which was emotional, because I still want them to be together. So that was very clever, very well done. The rest of the episode, I guess, can be quite heavy, but I think they managed to keep it quite light. And also just quite bizarre as well. Michael finds out that his old boss, Ed, died. Some other people in the office had worked with Ed. And they found out that he'd been decapitated, which, I'll be honest, was not in my prediction of how he died. And I did love the line that Michael said, his kappa is detated from his head, because I did not expect it, and I liked it. They're then throwing around one of those spiky ball things. I don't know what they're called, but you'll know exactly what I mean. Okay, I did end up Googling it. It took me a few Google searches, and slightly concerned for my search history now, but they're called expanding balls. And I loved these as a child. They're so fun. And they're throwing around this, which just adds a touch of, I guess, playfulness to a serious situation, which definitely makes it uncomfortable in a funny way. And Michael asks them to go around and name somebody they've lost and tell a bit of the story. And on the one hand, that seems very personal and not something that should be done in the workplace, but I feel like at the same time it actually could be beneficial to remember those we've lost, and also to show that everybody loses somebody at some point and that grief is universal. So maybe not the right setting, but the activity seems like it could be really beneficial. And Dwight has a story about his twin, and Pam has a story, and I'll come back to Pam in a minute. I didn't really get what Pam's was. And then Rainn tells the story of the Lion King. Kevin talks about Weekend at Bernie's. And then I realised Pam must be talking about a film. And I had to Google it. Thankfully, somebody on Reddit asked the same question, and apparently the film Pam is talking about is $1 Million Baby. Things definitely take an interesting turn after that point. Not that it wasn't interesting already, but Michael then tries to bring this dead bird back to life, putting this dead bird on the counters, and Michael decides really, to have a funeral for the bird. And Pam explains at one point, you never can tell what your day here is going to turn into, which I think is very true. That's definitely come across in the episodes that I've seen so far. I think with The Office, expecting the unexpected is the right way to go. And they have this funeral out in the parking lot, and there's this box for the bird. And Pam gives quite a lovely speech, actually. It's a nice speech. And then Dwight plays the recorder. I played the recorder for many years, so I'm part of that club. I don't know if I want to be in a club with Dwight, but nevertheless. And then Pam sings, and then they light the box on fire, and they just abandon this flaming box with the bird inside of it, and then Dwight tries to put out the fire and then kicks it repeatedly, well, stamps on it, but it's going everywhere. And that made me feel a bit sick because there's a corpse of a bird in there, and it's not a pleasant thought. But the image was ridiculously comical. So definitely an unpredictable episode. Funny. It definitely could have got quite heavy, but I think they managed to keep it quite light. And unfortunately, Jim was the only disappointment in this episode. I just don't understand. And maybe if I Googled it, I'd get more of an explanation, but I'm trying to avoid spoilers, so I'm trying to not Google too much about The Office. But I don't understand why they decided to move him. I mean, I'm assuming it's because they wanted to bring in new characters, but The Office, the building of The Office is only so big, so bringing in the other office means that there are other characters. Jan might be around more often. So, I don't know, I just feel like they could have moved somebody else, but then who would be prominent enough that we'd constantly cut back and forth? So, I don't know. Having said that, up until this point, it's worked. It's absolutely worked. Jim has been interesting. His stories have been decent enough, but not with this one. Nervous to see where they go with this, but excited as well. And for now, I can say Grief Counselling was definitely a very interesting episode of The Office.